Silicon technologies in the age of digital disruption. Panel debate which is devoted, I guess, to the thought and reflection of Bernard Stiegler, the French philosopher who died 2 years ago. And particularly to his reflection on techno-diversity and no-diversity, some terms created by the French philosopher. Let me introduce the panelists. Anne Alombert, philosopher, teaches philosophy at University 8 Paris. Her research focuses on the relation between knowledge and techniques in the work of Gilbert Simondon, Jacques Derrida and Bernard Stiegler. She's the co-founder of the collective Reorganise and a part and a member of the Internation collective. Michał Krzykawski, associate professor in philosophy literature and the head of the Center for Critical Technology Studies at the University of Silesia, also the member of Reorganise and co-founder of Reorganise and Internation. Daniel Ross, philosopher and translator of many books by Bernard Stiegler, including The Age of Disruption, Technology and Madness in Computational Capitalism, and author of the book of Violent Democracy and Psychopolitical Anaphylaxis. Gaël Giraud, economist, he served as chief economist and executive director of the French Development Agency since 2017. He has been a permanent fellow of the Nantes Institute for Advanced Studies, and since 2020 has been appointed as a research professor at Georgetown University, founding director of the Georgetown Environmental Justice Program. Michał Krzykawski will be moderating the discussion. And Michał, the floor is yours.
Thank you for this kind introduction. Thank you for coming. Sorry. Before you start,
we can't hear you. We can't hear you.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So once again, thank you for this kind introduction. Thank you for coming. Okay. So before we start, I would like to very shortly introduce the general idea, the general topic of this panel. And initially, this panel was meant to engage with several issues in the book Bifurcate, edited by Bernard Stiegler, and the collective Internation, composed of scholars representing different disciplines. And Dan and myself were members of this collective, and we co-authored several chapters of this book that Dan translated into English. And then we decided to ask Gaël Giraud to join our panel, and we are actually very happy that he has accepted our invitation. And there was at least two reasons why we did so. The first reason is that in this book, Bifurcate, we argued that the question about technology and the question about the living in all its forms, and especially in the context of biodiversity loss, are inseparable. They are related to each other. And Gaël takes the question about the living very seriously in his economic thinking, and moreover he argues that a macroeconomic model, the invention of this macroeconomic model involves us to working about how to recast economic thinking, philosophical thinking, and scientific thinking. So this was the first reason. And the second reason was that Bernard Stiegler was perfectly aware of Gaël's commitments and his economic thinking which takes into account issues related to thermodynamics. And this is why he wanted to open a collaboration with Gaël Giraud, because he also worked on these issues related to thermodynamics, entropy, and biophysical boundaries of the planet. And because Bernard, as Pavel said, passed away 2 years ago, we just thought that we might try to hold this mixed dialogue between these two intellectuals as far as we can, especially in order to articulate the ecological and technological concerns of our times. Right? So this is how we have come up with the final idea of this panel, and in order to start the panel, I would like my first question to go to Gaël Giraud. This question is about your project of the economy of the living, and about your attempt to rethink the economic process, taking into account the issues related to thermodynamics. Why this relation between thermodynamics, ecology, and economy is so important, and can it give us? Can it provide us, for example, with a new idea about what new macroeconomic indicators might look like beyond this dominant model of macroeconomic development we've known so far?
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the invitation, Dziękuję, and I'm very honored and pleased to be here with you. So I'm a little bit the outsider of the panel because I'm not a philosopher, and I will speak essentially as an economist. And try to answer the question. So maybe one way to explain my own intellectual journey is to say that a couple of years ago, I was talking with a friend of mine who is the president of Group 1 of IPCC. So IPCC, you know what it is? It's the international panel of experts working on climate change, global warming. She's a physicist and she is leading Group 1, which is dedicated to the science of climate. And we were giving a conference, both of us, and she realized that economists in most of the models, 99.9% of the models used by economists, violate peacefully the first two laws of thermodynamics. The first law, as you know, is energy is conserved no matter what. And second law, energy degrades across time. That is, there is an error of time, and as time unfolds, the quality of energy, so to say, declines, and this is the rise of entropy. So our models in economics never satisfy these two laws. And so my friend, she's a physicist, she said, in which world are you living, you economists? And no wonder whether we have a big crisis today where within the IPCC, some economists like Bill Nordhaus keep saying that, you know, global warming is not a big deal, plus 6 degrees at the end of this century on Earth on average will lead to minus 10% of the world real GDP, which is just nonsense. While climatologists say, well, this is just the apocalypse. And if we want to reconcile both scientific communities, we have to rethink completely, I believe, economics with a new framework, a new paradigm. And this paradigm, I believe, has something to do with living bodies. Why? Because neoclassical economics, that is the mainstream orthodox economics, only deals with capital, but capital, according to them or according to us, it's money and labor, human labor. But there is no energy, there is no matter. And human labor without energy and matter, that's just a corpse, you know, which doesn't do anything. So essentially, neoclassical economics deals with money and corpses and believes that putting them together increases GDP, which of course is just nonsense. So 99.9% of our models are just nonsense, to be honest with you. So the question for me is how to rewrite macroeconomics in such a way that macro can talk with biologists, ecologists, and the middle ground, the common language that we have is thermodynamics. The main idea is very, common to a certain extent. It has already been expressed by someone like Georgescu-Roegen, you know, in the 70s. And reformulated by Prigozhin in the 80s. So the main idea is to say that a living body is a dissipative structure. That is, it's a complex structure which lives out of equilibrium because it's fed by a flow of energy and matter. if you think of a city is a big metabolism, like the human body, which absorbs a lot of energy, a lot of matter, and right now we are dissipating energy through all the mechanisms that we use in order to organize this conference. So a city is a big metabolism which absorbs energy and matter, metabolizes this energy and this matter, and then just exudes some waste, which is degraded energy and degraded matter. More precisely, what a city does, or what an economy does, a big metabolism, is to extract low entropy energy, like fossil fuels. Low entropy meaning that it's a very strong energy of a high quality with a lot of exergy. Okay? It uses this energy both in order to develop itself and to extract matter. And the matter that is extracted by a city, by a human society, is a high entropy matter, that is, it's completely disorganized matter, like copper, if you extract copper, from the soil. And from this copper, you construct a manufactured product, an industrial product, which is a low entropy product. So essentially, we use low entropy energy in order to extract high entropy matter and to produce low entropy manufactured products and to exude high entropy energy. That's essentially our job from a thermodynamical viewpoint. The metabolization process does three things. First, we do work. Work is just an extension of mechanical work in physics. It has been introduced by a friend of mine, a physicist whose name is Bob Iris. So he calls it useful work, and for instance, this conference is a useful work in his sense. That is, it's a work that we organize, we human beings, because we think it's useful. And for that purpose, we use matter and we dissipate energy, including the energy of my own body. So that's work. But we are not going to repeat this tomorrow morning, at least not as far as I know. Second, we use energy and matter just to grow, like the body of a kid, he or she grows. And for that purpose, he or she uses matter and energy. Third, we use energy and matter in order to complexify ourselves, to invent new rules, new institutions, new patterns of behavior, etc., new traditions. So this is a way to complexify the internal structure of the society, which leads to a degrowth, or the reduction of entropy, internal entropy. In the same way, when I discuss with my friends here, I'm reducing the entropy of my brain because I become more clever. So I have more structure in my brain, so entropy in my brain reduces. I'm more clever, I'm smarter, thanks to them. And this is the job of a city. A city extracts energy and matter, and for that purpose, in order to talk with my friends, I need energy, so that's why we need to eat together, for instance, in a restaurant, to feed myself, otherwise I would just starve. It's the same story for a city. A city extracts energy, matter, in order to complexify itself. So essentially what it does is to reduce its internal entropy, what some people call sometimes negentropy, okay? And I think Anne will speak about this later on. So once we have said this, we have a kind of framework, and with a PhD student of mine, Grégoire Noël, we have written the math of this. It holds water, it works, and I do believe that's very important for economics. Now, you were asking also whether this leads to new indicators, and I will stop there. The answer is yes. There is one indicator which I believe is very inspiring, which has been introduced by Éric Chesson. So he has a French name, but he's not French. He lives in the US. And Chesson's ratio is the following. You compute the ratio between the quantity of energy that your metabolism is dissipating per unit of time, let's say per second, or per minute, or per day, divided by the mass, the weight of the structure. And what he shows, and this is part of the literature dedicated to big history, what he shows is that, a galaxy has a lower Chesson ratio than a planet. A plant has a lower Chesson's ratio than an animal. An amphibian has a lower Chesson's ratio than the human being. And the animals which exhibit the higher Chesson's ratio, according to him, are the birds. Because the birds dissipate a lot of energy per second, and they are very light. So why is this so, according to him? Because they have to move in 3 dimensions, while we human beings, usually we move only in 2 dimensions, so it's much easier. So to a certain extent, birds are the most complex living body that we can find on Earth today. You see? So now if you reflect with this ratio in mind and you ask yourself, would the Chaisson ratio be a good indicator, you know, of the quality, quote unquote, of a city, let's say, or an economy as a metabolism? Then you try to do the kind of exercise that I did. I compared, for instance, Atlanta, you know, in the US, with Barcelona in Spain, because these two cities have approximately the same population and the same GDP. So the same GDP per capita as a consequence. So they are very comparable. And I computed both Chaisson's ratio for Atlanta and Chaisson's ratio for Barcelona. And you would guess that Chaisson's ratio for Barcelona would be higher, because you would think it's much more complex, it's a much more complex city, you know, than Atlanta, which is essentially not a city, according to the European viewpoint. You know, Atlanta is just a bunch of houses related by streets with a mall in the center, and that's it. But surprisingly enough, Atlanta has a higher Chaisson's ratio. Why? Essentially because it wastes a lot of energy. Just, you know, people need to take a car just to buy cigarettes. So at the end of the day, the numerator, the quantity of energy you dissipate per unit of time is higher, but not for good reasons. So my viewpoint is that we should use something close to this, but replacing the quantity of energy you dissipate per unit of time by, let's say, the Human Development Index, the HDI, or any index of the quality of life of people. Divided by what? Divided by the weight of the city. And it happens that there is a report which has been just published by the International Resource Panel, IRP, which is a body of the G20, on the weight of cities, where people try to calculate, to compute the mass, the weight of a city like Warsaw, you know. And so if we think in these terms, this would be a way to say our main challenge in order to, you know, to implement the ecological transition, let's say, would be to increase the HDI, so education, life expectancy, a little bit of income, etc., while reducing the weight of our cities, to have light cities, you see. And this would go in the direction of Eric Chaisson's ratio, I think, and would be probably a good proxy of the quality of the complexity of the structure of a city or a metabolism, insofar this metabolism tries to reduce its own entropy. So I will stop here. Thank you.
So, thank you very much, Gaël. So I will try to articulate what Gaël said with what we tried to do in the book Bifurcate. So, first of all, we have a common theoretical reference, all of us, which is the work of Nicolas Georgescu again, and precisely this article, which is called the entropy law and the economic process. And in this article, Nicolas, which was published in 1971, Nicolas Georgescu is saying that, as Gaël has said just before, that the neoclassical economy was thought on the model of an outdated scientific model, in a way. So it was thought on the model of Newtonian physics or classical mechanics, but the problem is that the scientific framework is now outdated because it has been completely transformed with thermodynamic physics, which appeared at the beginning of, let's say, in the 19th century, with the Industrial Revolution, which is at the basis of what we today call the Anthropocene. So one of our main points, in the book Bifurcate, was to say that. So I show the book. So one of the big theses of this book was to say that this mainstream conception of economy requires a fundamental re-examination and has to be thought on other epistemic or epistemological foundations. So one of the aim of the book was to suggest a new epistemological framework which would be able to take into account the consequences of thermodynamic physics in economy and to put the question of entropy at the heart of the ecological and the economic debate. So this is the reason why, because we wanted to raise this question or this debate about entropy, this is the reason why we suggest to describe the Anthropocene with an A as an Anthropocene with an E, which was the main idea of the philosopher Bernard Stiegler, who was leading the group of researchers who wrote this book. So, what do we wanted to say with this word of Anthropocene with an E? We wanted to say that the Anthropocene can be described as a process of massive increase of entropy in all its forms. So thermodynamic entropy, as Gaël was speaking about just a second ago, which is dissipation of energy at a physical level, we could say, but also biological entropy, which is the reduction of biodiversity and the destruction of ecosystems, and also what we called in this book informational entropy or psychosocial entropy, which was aimed at describing the reduction of knowledge into data or calculations and the destruction of social and cultural diversity. So this thesis was a bit original in a way, because usually, as you have understood, entropy is a physical concept. It is used to measure the dissipation of physical energy, and it corresponds to the tendency of an isolated physical system towards disorder or disorganization. But it is not, this concept is not really used in other fields. I mean, it is used in the field of biology linked with thermodynamic physics, but it is not used in the fields of social sciences or anthropology. And this is what we wanted to try to do, in fact. And because we wanted to say that our current economic model should take into account not only thermodynamic and biological entropy, but also psychosocial entropy. And we were also saying that in the context of digital disruption, this psychosocial entropy is becoming very dangerous in a way. So I will try to explain a bit more what we were understanding with this notion of psychic and social entropy, and all these analyses are based on the work of Bernard Stiegler about disruption, the question of digital disruption. So according to him, the digital disruption has entropic effects at a psychosocial level. First, because the digital cultural industries are based on what we call, or what is called, persuasive technologies, which exploit the brain dopaminergic system and which stimulate our drives and make us become addicted to these technologies. This is why they are called persuasive technologies. So this addiction can be described as an entropic process because it leads us to disseminate our attention, so our psychic energies, and instead of investing those energies into long-term projects, for example, for artistic projects or political projects or scientific projects or any projects which requires a collective investment of psychic or libidinal energy. So in this sense, we can say that applications or social networks which are based on addictive technologies produce psychic entropy. But according to Bernard Stiegler, the main problem is not this one. The main problem is that digital technologies also produce psychosocial entropy because they tend to automatize the practice of knowledge. So, in fact, digital technologies have opened a new vague or a new stage of automation, which made it possible to automatize or to automate not only manual work or activities of production with digital robotics. For example, sorry, this I wanted to show that before to show the potential addictive technologies. But okay, this is what you can see in this is the digital robots which are used in Amazon warehouses, and but digital technologies also so they also imply most of the time an automation or an automatization of what we usually call intellectual work or activities of theorization, which tend to be automated through big data and algorithms. This is what was described in this provocative article. And also social knowledge or existential knowledge, which tend to be automated with connected objects and smart cities and all this kind of the digitalization of everyday life environments. So all kind of knowledge, so practical knowledge, technical knowledge, social knowledge, existential knowledge, and also theoretical knowledge can now in a way be automated, and this automation can become entropic. Because the problem is when a knowledge is automated, it means that it becomes a procedure which is formalized and implemented in a technical system which works in the same way everywhere and which cannot evolve, which cannot be transformed in a way. On the contrary, when a knowledge is practiced by living beings, it is always practiced in different ways, so it produces some diversity in this sense, and it also transforms itself through time. Because when they practice a knowledge, the people transform it in a singular way through their practice. So, for Bernard Stiegler, the important point here is that through the practice of this different kind of knowledge, human societies differentiate from one another and evolve through time. So this different kind of knowledge are at the basis of cultural diversity and social evolution. So it can be very dangerous in this sense to eliminate knowledge through automation, because it can lead to an elimination of social and cultural diversity, which can be described as an entropic tendency at the psychic and social level, or at the cultural level, let's say. So in this sense, digital disruption can also produce entropy at the social level, because most of the time these disruptive innovations shortcut the collective rules of the localities in which they develop. For example, giant tech companies such as Google or Amazon impose their rules to territories in spite of local economic or political regulations, and this leads to a process of disorganization and homogenization, at a social level, which eliminates local institutional and legal local institutions, and legal differences, and which leads to what has been called algorithmic governmentality or functional sovereignty of digital platforms. So just to finish on this point, what we wanted to show in this analysis was to say that the Anthropocene is at the same time a problem of thermodynamic and ecological entropy, with the dissipation of natural resources and the reduction of biodiversity, and also at the same time a problem of psychic and social entropy, as the dissipation of psychic resources, attention, and destruction of collective organization or cultural diversity. So for this reason, what we wanted to do was to suggest to rethink economy on the basis of this analysis, in order to fight against the thermodynamic and ecological entropy, as Gaël has shown just before, but also against the psychic and social entropy. And this was what we were trying to suggest with the model of the contributory economy. So, Michał, maybe I can let you speak about this, and okay.
Thank you, Anne. Yes, I'm going to follow up on one particular aspect of what Anne said, namely that of knowledge. Because knowledge is the pillar of what you briefly outlined as contributory economy, whereas the production of knowledge, as Bernard Stiegler argues, is what should become the meaning of work, defined beyond what we call labor. And I would like to discuss this link between the loss of knowledge and digital disruption, and also the link between the loss of knowledge and biodiversity loss. The loss of knowledge is, I argue, an ecological issue, and digital disruption has something important to do with this loss. Now, why am I claiming this? Well, if political ecology, in very general terms, is about taking care of the living environment as something which determines the quality of life and the quality of a given civilization, then it is really hard to deal with the ecological question today without taking care of the digital environment, precisely because it potently determines, as you know, the quality of our lives. And we all feel that digital environment becomes more and more toxic. And taking into account this toxicity, I would like to refer to one of Stiegler's concepts, that of no diversity. That is the diversity of knowledge, the multiple forms of knowledge which sustain human civilization. Consider no diversity a specifically human equivalent of the biosphere, something that human beings, human societies, are potentially capable of creating artificially through their complex relations with techniques and technologies. Because the production of knowledge is impossible, materially impossible, without artificial supports. And today, as you might know perhaps, many scholars in humanities say that we must overcome the anthropocentric perspective. We must stop saying human, 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 and finally recognize that we are a small part of the biosphere. I totally sympathize with such claims. But the question is how to do that in relation to economic process and technological development. We should not forget that the anthropos, the human, means or can also mean quite a beautiful diversity, which is precisely the diversity of different forms of knowledge. The knowledge of how to do, the knowledge of how to live, how to contemplate, how to raise children, how to befriend, how to make love, etc. From this perspective, one can see a striking paradox of the Anthropocene. This paradox is that the human species, in a way, is endangered in its diversity, which makes our civilization sustainable, even though we have become, as we know, the geological force that has critically deregulated the Earth system. But this is not the geological problem at all, it is a political problem, namely that of capitalism. So I believe that we should fight for the preservation of no diversity. And this means, first of all, to deliberate on the technological conditions in which and under which the preservation of no diversity is possible to the same extent as the preservation of biodiversity. These two dimensions are absolutely necessary to be combined one with each other. So if we really want to ask how to reorganize silicon technologies in the age of disruption, we should ask how silicon can materially support the production of knowledge. This is a fundamental question to me. And this is also related to the main goal of contributory economy, which is to reevaluate knowledge of all kinds and to remunerate work as a production of knowledge through a contributory income. And now, what is knowledge? what Bernard Stiegler was trying to say is that knowledge is something larger than the academic meaning of this term. Knowledge is something which is also not reducible to information, because knowledge always involves a transformation of information. Knowledge is not data either, although we need data to produce new forms of knowledge in the digital environment. And this is precisely why we should have control over our data instead of giving this gift back for free. Because data comes from the Latin word datum, which means precisely a gift, a present. Data is what can produce value, and value is related to knowledge. Knowledge is what I am capable of doing by means of technologies that I have at my disposal, no matter if I am a scientist, a gardener, a programmer, a nurse, or someone else. Now, I do not really think that digital disruption fosters the production of knowledge. On the contrary, it fosters what Bernard Stiegler called proletarianization, and Dan will elaborate a little bit on this, on another concept of Stiegler. Firstly, because it reduces what we can know to quantify the data. So the big issue with digital disruption is not only the fact that digital industry potently remains a neo-colonial and extractivist project, as we can see upstairs, even though it is essential, of course, but what is also problematic is the fact that statistical quantification digital industry is based on short circuits all kinds of more or less local relations that are essential to the production of knowledge, to the production of knowledge diversity. In a nutshell, digital disruption is not ecological on many levels because it reduces technology to a mere functionalism. Moreover, it does not really promise a better future because quantification as well as computation and automation can only enhance what is already here, right? Make it even more efficient, more compressed, faster. And this has no future, at least on Earth. So to know is not to disrupt. The ideologues of disruption say that we cannot avoid it as if it were our fate. There is one direction of the technological development, and we, societies or individuals, have to adapt. They also say that societies must become resilient in order to absorb the technological shock. This word, resilience, is somewhat over-abused and very fashionable, so we have to take care about it, and then we'll go back to this too. And so what these ideologues really want to say is that there is no alternative, right? And in Bifurcate, we have tried to hijack this neoliberal slogan, now libertarian. We say there is, in fact, no alternative because we must bifurcate, we must produce the improbable. And what Bernard Stiegler was trying to say through his sophisticated and complex concepts is actually a very simple message. This message is that we are still able to transform what made Uber, Facebook, or Amazon, as well as chatbots and other AI systems, possible into something better. But we need new concepts for such a transformation. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, thank you. Michał gave some good reasons why we invited Gaël here, but he didn't really tell the truth. Really, what we're trying to do here, the three of us, is to set a trap in order to force him to listen to us for half an hour or an hour. And that's because we really care about what he thinks and the kind of economics that he's doing and the motivations for that economics, but we want to make him think about something in a very different way and in a way that might be kind of shocking for him. And so I want to give an example to show you why he might think it's shocking. But for sure he's too smart to fall into our trap, but nevertheless we can maybe at least say something. In one of his books, Bernard Stiegler talks about what it's like on a Sunday morning when you wake up and you're bored and you don't know what to do. And you wander around in the streets of the city and you come across a cinema and you decide for no reason to go into the cinema. And it happens to be that the movie is a good one. And you watch the movie and you get into it. Maybe you have some popcorn as well. And when you come out of the movie, you have a lot of energy that you absolutely didn't have when you woke up in the morning. It could be that you have energy because the popcorn gave you something that you needed for your body and also for your mind, but probably it wasn't the popcorn, it was the movie. Something happened in a circuit between you and what appears on the screen. You cannot explain that in any way with thermodynamics. Because there's nothing, no physical energy is exchanged. And of course, it's totally understandable to object to that on the grounds that, well, this isn't really energy in a sense that we can recognize, that we can measure, that we can make a model about. And yet, it's not only metaphorical, it's also real. It makes a real difference to the rest of our day. When we talk about diversity, we're talking about a kind of richness that can make a difference. And that's why it matters that the movie has to be a good one. If the movie is a bad one, which means, for instance, a totally standardized one that doesn't surprise us in any way, then it won't give us any more energy because it won't make a difference. It will just be probable. It's what we knew we were probably going to get from a bad movie. And so one of the ways in which Bernard Stiegler likes to think about what diversity means is that it means the improbable. And we can understand this in biological life in terms of the improbability of the fact of life at all. There's no two essences, organic matter and inorganic matter, but at some point, in a highly improbable way, life starts to happen and this molecule begins to form, and this molecule begins to diversify itself across species with different organs and so on. And it maintains itself improbably against that second law of thermodynamics, which is the tendency towards the probable. For me, it's important to say it's not only a question of structures and orders. Because if there's something that goes counter to entropy, it's not just a question of structures. For instance, a crystal seems like a structure, but it doesn't behave in a negentropic way in the same way as life does. The crystal state uses entropy more than the liquid. It's a lowering of the state from the liquid that looks to be less ordered than the crystal. So what's the difference? The difference is not order, but organization. Of course, all these concepts are very hard to define when you get to a real scientific level. But organization means that all the parts are strongly connected with each other, and that it unfolds as a kind of history of a crisis situation, in the sense that if it doesn't keep using energy in a particular way, it falls apart. What we want to say, I think, is that the kind of life that we are is a different kind of organization. And it's different because it doesn't just go through our body or our species, but through an outside that is not organic at all, but it is organized. This computer is not organic, but it's organized. The movie is not organic, but it is organized. And that makes a difference. And the difference that it makes is that it has two sides in a new way. As Michał was saying, it can produce information. It can produce the probable, but not the probable in the sense of thermodynamic entropy, but the probable in the sense of the average of the standardized, of the predictable, of bad movies and bad art and bad literature and bad conversation. Or it can produce a real diversity, in the same way as negentropic processes of evolution, of the evolution of life, produce real diversity. And it's never one species in an ecosystem that is resilient. It's the proliferation that produces that ecosystem that is the resilience. And in the same way, diversity in human life is not a question of going to the supermarket and seeing that you have many choices of white bread. This is not or laundry powder. This is not diversity, because it doesn't make any difference. What's diversity is when this proliferation makes a difference to your life because it contains surprises, the encounter between singular existences, Gaël's existence and my existence in our singular histories, that produces a tension out of which something surprising can happen that we weren't expecting, even though we planted the trap. And so for us, resilience is the question, and diversity is the question of how to use these technologies that can so easily be used to reduce everything to calculable information, to instead generate and intensify and make wealthier and richer the singular existences of our individual lives and our collective lives, such that together we have a resilience that's necessary, because if there is a problem in this Anthropocene, and the fact is that everybody knows it, and yet we never managed to find the will to solve it thus far. We could say that this is because the powerful interests control things, and obviously that's true in many ways, but that's not good enough. The problem is also ours, that we can't find the will to take care in the way that we need to as well. We too are like the person who wakes up on a Sunday morning and doesn't have enough energy to really care. And the solution to that is not to get away from technologies, but to find technological mechanisms that can help us to foster our differences in order to create good tensions and make good differences.
Thanks, Dan. We talk a lot, but we might continue, but we would be happy to take some questions before continuing. So, if you have any comments or questions, sorry. Yes, because
So thank you very much for the interventions. I have one question, but it's a little bit more technical, and I think it's probably direct more to Mr. Giraud, because, but also to others as well. You know, you share a figure in common that is George Giraud. And of course, in the 70s, he proposed a bioeconomics that introduced the concept of entropy as a critique of the neoclassical economics. But in the work of George Giraud, here I refer to his writing on entropy, he rejects the relation between entropy and information. And this is very clear in his entry for the new paragraph Dictionary of Economics. And something that was raised again by very much criticized by Mirowski, by Philip Mirowski in his history of cybernetics and so on. So I wonder, you know, how would you come, you know, when we talk about entropy and George Giraud today, and the fact that we are actually in a kind of information world or digital world, how would you reconcile these two, you know, after George Giraud, his notion of entropy and the entropy that is used in information theory?
Should I answer now? Okay. Yeah, thank you. It's a big question. Thank you for raising this question. So just, I don't know whether everybody knows that, but there are at least two ways to understand entropy. So there is the thermodynamical way, which is a way to say, just to understand how it works. Suppose that you take this box, okay, this square here, and you look at all the particles which are in this square. And you look at the probability according to which the organization of these particles may happen. So if the particles here are highly organized, the probability that this happens at random is very low. So that's why entropy is low. If particles are just spread, you know, randomly, then the probability is high and entropy is high. So that's the Boltzmann interpretation. Ludwig Boltzmann, you know, the German physicist from the late 19th century. That's the usual interpretation of entropy by physicists, which goes back to the end of the 19th century. Now, there is a second interpretation which uses the same word, entropy, put forward by Shannon in the 30s and 40s of the 20th century, which says something completely different, apparently, which is that there is a quantity of information transmitted or transferred in a message that you can compute, and which is entropy. So, for instance, when I talk to you, and if there is a lot of noise, like this, when I talk, because we are in Beirut 86, then the entropy is high because there is a lot of noise that you have to get rid of in order to understand what I'm saying. You see what I mean? So that's the entropy in the sense of Shannon, so to say. And then there is a big theoretical question, which is, do the two entropies coincide, or are these completely different concepts? So now, part of my answer to your question is that I don't need both definitions to coincide. So, I mean, I'm okay with that. Now, it happens that there are a number of people, physicists, who claim that they can prove that both coincide. I'm partially convinced by the proof, which is the fact that in order to increase the information, in the sense of Shannon, you need to add some bits, you know, somewhere, and a bit can have a thermodynamical translation in terms of the quantity of energy you need to add one bit. There is a minimal quantity of energy which is linked to quantum mechanics. So, you know, a bit is just to change a 0 into a 1 or 1 into a 0. And from quantum mechanics, you know that this requires a minimal amount of energy. So these people go in this direction in order to claim that both definitions coincide. Fair enough. I don't need this. Maybe they are right, maybe not. I'm not a physicist. I'm partially convinced, it seems to me to be convincing, but I know that it's quite controversial today. And in any case, I'm happy that if both don't coincide, I'm happy with that. You know, entropy, in the sense I was using it, and I guess most of us are using it today, is a way to describe for me, the institutions, the rules, the patterns of behavior within the socio-metabolic body that is a city. For instance, just the fact that we drive on the right, while in South Africa, where I was yesterday, people drive on the left. So it's just, you know, if you try to change this, it's a big deal, you know? So it's a pattern of behavior which has been imposed by conventions, time, and all this, which structures a lot how people interact with each other. So this is, for me, it's part of the structure, and it has something to do with entropy in the sense I use this word. So that's a simple illustration. I don't know whether I answer your question, but I hope so.
Yes. No, maybe if I can just add something is that it is a very complicated debate because in fact Bernard Stiegler was really critical against the theory of the information theory, the way in which information theory is using entropy, and I think he was much more leaning on the thermodynamic and then biological conception of entropy, which is not the same, in fact, because it's, I mean, I'm not a specialist of these questions, but it seemed quite evident that when we are speaking about exchanges about matter, of matter and energy, it has nothing to do or not much things to do with this question of probability of improbability of a message, you know, which was Shannon's problem because Shannon was working in telecommunications and all of these things. But I'm adding that because maybe you have a point of view on that, I don't know, but maybe you know that Bernard Stiegler was quite critical about this theory of information. And also he was critical about it because his theory leads him to speak about not to measure the probability of a message, but to measure in a way the destruction of knowledge through information. This is what Michał was speaking about. The fact that, you know, a knowledge is something which is living. In a way, a knowledge is always, it always belongs to the living. This is why the economy of knowledge is part of an economy of the living, because you can have knowledge only if you have living beings who are practicing this knowledge together, whereas information is something which has been externalized in a technical support and which can be, I mean, you know, you can download informations and things like that, but it is not something that you can practice and interpret and make evolve. So I think there are like, yes, there is a kind of bifurcation in the theory of entropy with this theory of information and the Bernard Stiegler theory of knowledge, which relies on this concept of entropy, which are linked with thermodynamics and biology and not with information theory. But I don't know if it's really clear because it's not clear for me.
Yeah, I think I'd like to say one thing about that too, because we keep talking about the distinction between knowledge and information, and I think we can give another example or two to help to make it clear. To say that it is living is also to say that it has a different relationship to time than information does, in the way that it spreads. If I want to make money on the stock market, then a piece of information can be very valuable to me, as long as you don't have the same information as I have. Like, I have the inside knowledge, but it's not knowledge, it's information, let's say. And it can only be of value to me while I'm the only one that has it, or few people have it. The wider it spreads, the less valuable it is, because the difference it can make to me becomes less. But knowledge is not like that. The knowledge that I'm sharing with you, if it is real knowledge, is something that is more valuable to me if you have it. And the way that you have it will be different from the way that I have it. I'll tell you something that I believe to be knowledge, but what you understand by that knowledge is not the same thing as what I understand by that knowledge, because our histories are different. And because of that, between us, we can produce something. We might aim towards the same understanding in our knowledge. That's what we're trying to do here, but we will never get there. And this also relates to the distinction between investment and speculation. I can use information to speculate. I can have a very complicated computer program that understands that a lot of the time when it goes like this, then next thing it's going to do that, and you can make money from guessing, knowing nothing about the companies in which you are putting your money. But it only works until it stops working. And then it doesn't work, you know, then it crashes. Whereas investment is a way of relating to the future based on knowledge. You know something about where you're putting your energy, your time, your effort, and so on. In the same way, a newspaper contains a lot of information, but it loses its value quickly. And so the next day, it's very hard to sell yesterday's newspaper. Does that mean it doesn't contain any knowledge? No, it doesn't mean that. But the knowledge that it contains depends on you. It depends on your practice of reading that newspaper in a way that draws knowledge from the information. It's a relationship. And so knowledge and information in that way are not an opposition. Something that it seems to be purely informational might in fact be a source, an exteriorized source from which you can create knowledge if you use an old newspaper as an archive, as a document, something like that. But as a source of news, it runs out. As information, it runs out of value. So the question of diversity in this way is also a question of the production of lasting values.
Yeah, I don't have much to add to what you've said, right? Because I think that the production of knowledge is precisely essential, right? If we want to really discuss an alternative beyond the state we are in, right? Because, you know, entropy in very general terms is the tendency of systems and organisms to lose their potential to recreate their energy, right, organization. So, and the knowledge, the production of knowledge is something megantropical, right, quite contrary to information.
Thank you. Yes, thank you very much for sharing your thoughts. I will attempt 2 questions. The first one is for Gaël. And so you described this process of what the city does as a process of extraction of energy and matter. And to me, when that word is mentioned, my ears perk up, extraction, because it's, at least as described in this model, it seems to me a bit abstract and depoliticized. Extraction is not evenly distributed. And so the problem is that we already have light cities, or at least we have cities that are lighter than others. And the reason why some cities are light and some are heavy is because of politics and history. So my question to you is there a space in this model for politics and history? The other question is for Anne, Dan, and Michał. And I guess I just want to understand better this notion of diversity and how is it enough to rescue the technologies that we already have? I mean, to put it in very simplistic terms, I guess this is the question of whether the master's tools can dismantle the master's house. Can we diversify the technologies that we already have and change them significantly? Or do we need completely different set of tools. I guess I didn't understand that equation very well. So if you could speak more about it, I would appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for this other very interesting question. The way I would answer to it would be to say, of course, hopefully there is room for an analysis of power inside this big thermodynamical paradigm. Insofar, the structure of the metabolism depends upon rules, institutions, and relations of power. So the way I try to understand it, at least in my book, which will be published in October this year in French, is the following. It seems to me we can rely on the beautiful work by Elinor Ostrom, who is she was an American, US-American economist, or political scientist, who got the Nobel Award in economics, in 2009. And she, working on a huge literature devoted to the commons and commoning, she uses to divide goods into 4 categories. Private goods, public goods, which are dealt with by the state, let's say a state-owned bureaucracy. Commons, which are dealt with by a community, which shares this resource and tries to find rules so that everybody gets a little bit of it in order to keep the resource. And tribal goods, or network goods, which are reserved to a tribe, which share the goods only within the tribe. And so we could try to analyze the various institutions and the way they shape the structure of a metabolism using private ownership, public ownership, commons, and tribal ownership. And it seems to me this sheds a lot of light on how power can organize a society. To a certain extent, we could say neoliberalism for 40 years now tries to privatize everything, to turn everything into a commodity, to commodify everything, and to turn it into a private ownership. And on the other hand, we could say the Soviet or the Chinese experiment was a way to try to absorb the entire social sphere within the state-owned ownership. So both are just very frightening, and the issue is how to escape from this dilemma, which is just leading to death of the metabolism. And so today, it seems to me, the destruction of our social bounds by neoliberalism, by the privatization, leads to either the commons, and there are a lot of initiatives taken in the direction of commoning, or tribalism. And there are a lot of initiatives, unfortunately, taken by poor people and very wealthy people, both, who try just to save themselves by organizing tribal relationships. And that's, for me, that's the big, I would say, political challenge for the next decades, centuries maybe, that we are to choose the commoning solution rather than the tribal solution. Now, when you look at countries where the state is collapsing, like Lebanon today, unfortunately, people rely on the tribe to save themselves. So, big questions for me is how to rethink the political role and the philosophical role of the state as being the entity which creates the conditions of possibility of emergence of commons within the civil society in order to have a wealthy metabolism with a lot of biodiversity. Now, just I add one word, I'm sorry I'm too long. What I try to do is also to think the counterpart of this. So far I spoke only about, let's say, political structures, but it seems to me there is the counterpart of it, which is in hermeneutics. Why? Because at the end of the day, if you think of the different ways we organize ourselves in order to deal with a resource, actually what we do is we agree on rules. And these rules might be that it's private ownership, so someone is the owner of this and he's the unique guy on earth to be the owner of that, or public ownership, etc. So at the end of the day, this boils down to rules on which we agree. And the question is the hermeneutical role of the rule, status of the rules. And it seems to me we could say there are rules which claim to be public, a public language, that is a language which is supposed to be universal, that everybody is supposed to understand no matter what, like the law here. I mean, if you drive when the traffic light is red and the policeman takes you, you cannot discuss the rule. You cannot say, well, I don't have the same interpretation as you, etc., etc. So you're supposed to know the law, and the law is universal, and it applies to you. period. So that's a public language. By opposition, you have a private language, which is the old topic of Descartes, maybe you know Wittgenstein and all these people who tried to think about, is it possible to have a private language, which is actually a self-defeating concept, because if you're the unique guy on earth thinking with this private language, nobody can talk to you and you cannot talk to anybody. So, and then you have two positions, two possibilities, which are language or rules as a commons. And it seems to me this goes in the direction of what you were describing following Stigler in terms of knowledge. That is, it's a kind of rule which incorporates the possibility for other people, let's say new generations, to reinterpret the rules in a completely different way and therefore to rewrite the rules. So, and this is embodied into the rules themselves. And you have tribal rules which do not allow that because they supposedly are based on, let's say, the tradition or a big mythological narrative which says, you know, Moses came from the mountain, gave the law, and that's it, period. You see? So my viewpoint is that what we have to try to do is to foster rules, political rules as commons. And then the big question is, again, how do we organize the state in such a way that the state itself understands its own, let's say, constitution and body of laws as being built on commons, hermeneutical commons, in order for the civil society to discuss democratically about these rules and to change them when we feel we have to change them. You see?
Yes, maybe I will let you answer to the technological question if you want, but just I add a word on what Gaël just said, and also to link this with what Dan was saying just before about the difference about information and knowledge. What we were trying to say precisely was that knowledge is a common in this sense, that it is always to practice a knowledge, whether it be a practical knowledge, a technical knowledge, a social knowledge, or a theoretical knowledge, it's always a matter of sharing rules, as Gaël just said, that it means you share common rules, and these rules have to be common because otherwise it is not a knowledge, and they also have to be public, and most of the time it's not the same thing in the case of empirical knowledge than in the case of theoretical knowledge, but for example, scientific knowledge means that the rules must be explained, explicit, and publicly debated or debatable. So it's always, so this is why we are also trying to articulate this contributory economy, which is an economy of knowledge with these questions of the economy of the commons. Because at the beginning, the definition of Ostrom, I'm not sure about that, but I think is really about the fact of sharing common rules in order to organize, to share, for example, a material or a natural resource. But the point is like how to organize together through sharing some common rules. So yes, I just wanted to make these points. But yes, so now the question about technological. Maybe you want to say something about that.
Quickly, you know.
I thought I heard all of you say in some way that diversity is going to be a means, or it can be applied as a way to transform the technologies that we already have. And so I'm wondering about the limits of that. To what extent do we need to start from scratch, or to what extent do we take the technologies that we have and diversify them to change them?
It's a very complicated question. I guess it kind of sounds like, with that question, that there's technology on one side and diversity on the other side. And I think that what we want to say is that it's more complex than that because they are interrelated with each other. For us, all knowledge is technical or technological. In the sense that if we even need to use a word knowledge, it's because for animals, They don't need to have knowledge to decide what to do in the same way that we do. We have to decide how to live. And to decide how to live means to have different criteria to make those decisions. And those criteria change over time and are always a product of a history, and a history that has transformations, and that history is always a technical history. So, maybe the other way you have to think about that is through the relationship between what a guy called Reorganise talked about as the difference between technical tendencies and technical facts. Sorry to get technical. But a technical tendency means that, that things in different places, different localities, but with the same function, tend towards the same shape. For instance, a knife in one culture and another culture will not be identical, but will tend towards being similar. The technical fact is the distinction between the two expressions of this tendency. And this is something you see not only in technical life, but in biological life. When an animal goes back to the sea and becomes a dolphin, it's similar to a shark, but in its form. So this is a characteristic that means that diversity doesn't mean anything. It's related to the way, the things we need, the functions we have to have in order to be able to live. But for us, that question of how to live, which is always a technical question, is not a question, is a question that we have to decide about with knowledge. So what I'm trying to say really in a roundabout way is that it's not a choice between fixing the technologies that we have with diversity or abandoning those technologies and replacing them with a new kind of technology that produces diversity. We are in an unfolding history. In that unfolding history, our techniques can stop us from producing diversity. And the whole problem we have today is that very often it makes it harder and harder for us to do so, but we can't solve that by stopping everything and starting again. We have to encourage new tendencies and new possibilities in this way. And that's why for Stiegler, if he asks about the question of democracy, let's say, and political constitutions and so on, he says that, okay, for somebody like Hayek, democracy is a free space of decision. But the free space of decision that Hayek imagines is the space of the market and of atomized individuals and so on. But this is not really the question of democracy. At the same time, the question of democracy, he says, is not about the protection of the majority against something, but it's not even about the protection of minorities against power. It's about the protection of diversities. And the difference is that minority and majority are measuring things you measure. Diversity is not something you measure. It's a question of improbabilities. Yep.
Just about the question about the technological question, the question of technologies, because I think there was also an important point in the one of the chapter of this book about, you know, like, as Dan was saying, the question is not like, should we abandon the technology we have or should we lean on them, but more, I guess, the question was to say, these technologies have some uniform, they produce they produce some uniformizing or homogenizing effects, okay, because they are based on calculations. And when you calculate, I mean, if you want to calculate something, it has to be homogeneous, okay? It has to be comparable. So the question was, how could we introduce into those technical systems some deliberative process or some hermeneutic process? This means activities which are decisional process. This means activities which requires process of interpretation or deliberation or reflection, which are always singular, which you cannot calculate, because the way in which you will interpret something or the way in which you will decide always depends on the context or on the local context where you are. And this is not something that can be calculated automatically, okay? It always requires a singular effort in a way. And I think that, yes, what we were trying to, I'm sorry because it's not concrete, but it has concrete technological implications, which are, how could you manage to introduce some interpretative process into these technologies, which are computational technologies, in order that they are not just computational systems, but that they also require human activity. And I think this is also an important question.
Yeah, actually, the contemporary technical system is an abstract machine. Whether the challenge is to retrieve this purely empirical dimension of technical life, right? Which means that we should try to ask questions about how subscribe this technological system in the territorial processes of producing knowledge, because knowledge is always conditioned locally. Whether this abstract machine is planetary, because it goes beyond any boundaries, and then perhaps we could fight against this obvious tendency of the technical system to homogenize, right? When we subscribe technology in plural, multiple localities.
Thank you very much for your presentations. I keep looking at the cover for the book, and I think it is a very symbolic. The question that I would have is, you know, I believe there is a chance to have, there are these two rats and they are actually touching, their tails are touching. And I'm curious if there is a way to create a situation when there is a relationship between these two rats and there is no symbolic violence between the two. And this is my question for you. For example, an idea of creating communities, and there are such communities which completely separate themselves from certain technologies. And I would be curious about hearing your opinion about situations where there are communities that truly are trying to preserve and their own identity without subscribing to the global. Because I understand your concept that everything needs to be truly global. So I would be curious about, is there a way to create intentional communities that live outside some of the so-called progressive world?
it seems to me that you're raising the possibility of a future that where groups separate themselves from what you're calling a global system, right? Fair enough. But the problems that we have as a planet are global. And so if you're going to ask questions about that, what to do about those global problems, global level problems, then either that solution itself has to be globalized, you know, that we all give up the technologies that are causing that problem, or we need a technological approach that can help us. And in my opinion, the future of human life on this planet not only is technological, but it is industrial. In other words, the future of life on this planet is not going to be going back to village life or some de-technologized life. I just don't see that that's a choice that we have. And to try that choice would itself produce many new problems that we would then have to face. You could compare it with something like the Unabomber, right? The Unabomber's Theodore Kaczynski, his position is that all attempts to control the technical system or any big-scale human produced world, attempts to control that fail. And therefore he concludes that it's better to completely destroy the technical system and start again. And he goes so far as to say that, okay, this risks producing a nuclear apocalypse because it's a very dangerous thing to do. But in this choice, it's better to have the nuclear apocalypse and because the biosphere will survive, rather than to keep going in the technical system we've got. Now, I don't agree with his position because I don't want to have the nuclear apocalypse. I don't want to be put into that position. And so I think that unless we want to take his position, our challenge is to find not a solution that's technological, but approaches that can help us renegotiate the relationship between the technical systems and the industrial systems that we have, and a world in which diversity of all kinds, biological, informational, and so on, psychosocial, as Anne said, can coexist in a mutually reinforcing way. Maybe it's as impossible a dream as the Unabombers, but it's the only one that I can believe in, however impossible it may be.
Yeah, I can add a few words. The way I understand your question goes back to different initiatives which are taken today. On the one hand, by young people, the young generation, where some of them are tempted to organize themselves in small communities, ecological communities, where they live completely apart from the rest of the society in a kind of Edenic, new age community. And of course, it doesn't lead very far because they rely on the rest of the society just to have food and all these kind of questions. So there is a kind of, self-defeating attempt in this direction. And on the other hand, what very wealthy people dream of, that is a small island where they can just build a huge, gated community, apart from the poor, where they will be able to save themselves, having access to energy, water, and minerals. And it seems to me both dreams are completely crazy because, as you just said, the ecological polycrisis we are in is global. So two very simple examples. The pandemic, the coronavirus pandemic. We have learned now that the health of a family in Wuhan, China, matters for the entire planet. And this will just be the case again in the coming decades, because we know that climate change is going to foster tropical pandemics. So malaria is going to come back to France, for instance, or to the US in the coming decades, most probably, etc., etc. And so there is no isolated island where you can escape from that, from a virus. And second, there is also this very simple fact, which is that we know that when the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere will reach something like 1,000 ppm, parts per million. Today we have 417. So with 1,000 ppm in the atmosphere, then the human brain loses approximately 50% of its skills for high-skill activities and 25% for routines. So what I used to say to very wealthy people who dream of the isolated island, maybe you will find this island, but you know, your kids will be completely nuts. Because no matter how big the gates will be to protect yourself against the poor, you will breathe this, poison in the atmosphere, and your kid will be nuts. They will lose 50% of the high skill, skills. So, is this the world you want to be in? So you see, it's just a way to say, this dream of the Essenians, the religious community which is pure and lives somewhere else outside of the society, is just impossible, it seems to me.
This is a fascinating world that we can discuss and conceptualize. I've been thinking, at some point, what makes life and living matter different and where life ends. I interpreted life, living organisms, as fighting the disruption from the material world. And it's every day that we seem to endlessly fix what the material world is breaking down for us. And when we lose the will to fix what's around us, we die. And it's a little bit of how I interpret entropy as distinct feature of what a conscious living being can do. And we live a constant fight. And now the question is, from a cosmological, perspective, the axis of time may be symmetric, but the way the politicians, which kind of rule our world, make decisions is often by trial and error. It's in a naive way thinking that they can please the electorate by a small change, but at some point the time axis is not going to allow for correction. A disruption might make the world irreversible. We know it from the climate perspective, but I guess it can happen on many different levels. So disruption within some bounds might make experimenting with the world around us to find a better global optimum. But the trick is to be aware of the bounds which make it possible to go back to fix, or sometimes it's too late. So
that's exactly it. Every system exists within those bounds that make it possible not to be stable, but to be more or less stable. And that means also more or less unstable. And sometimes you're heading towards those limits, those boundaries, without it being visible straight away, because it's under the surface. But at some point, you encounter those limits. And when you encounter those limits, the only choice is to transform or to collapse. What Stiegler is saying is that we're living in a time where we're encountering those bounds more than one at a time, all together at the same time. It's not just climate, it's also the limit of the economic model that we're living today. And these things clash with each other too, so that people can say that trying to solve one will also solve the other, but it can also work the other way. But also that one of the bounds that doesn't get talked about as much is not just something like a financial crisis along with climate change and things like that, but also a bound of the amount of knowledge we can destroy, the amount of thinking capacity, the amount of time for reflection. When you begin to destroy those as well, you also reach a limit. And if you reach all of these limits at the same time, then you really face a situation where unless you produce a process of transition to some other kind of system, it's guaranteed that you're going to collapse. So we live in a crucial time in that way. And Stiegler's message, I think, in relation to that is we must not forget that one of these bounds is the amount of stupidity and craziness we can produce before we're not capable of solving anything at all. So it's to remember that one too.
I would just add to it, it's the speed of change and the amount of information that we are not able to process as a single decision maker. So we might use the algorithms and the like big data type way of looking to see the forest through the trees. But to some extent it might help the decisions. But sooner or later, the speed of change is going to overwhelm whatever way we want to. We want to spread the responsibility for decision making. That's democracy. So that's my hope.
Yes, maybe if I can just add something. Ah, it's the time, okay. Oui, non, il faut qu'on s'arrête. Ah oui, il y a une heure et demie, ouais. No, I just wanted to say that all these were linked because the question of like informational entropy and the production of what you call stupidity or craziness is also, it implies that then you will deny like scientific information about climate change and things like that, so that you will not take the good measures or the good political or economic measures in order to stop this catastrophe. So, just to say that all these problems and the reaching of all these limits are linked together. That's
so if there is no further questions, I think we can stop here. I'm very pleased to invite you in 15 minutes to the lecture by Yuk Hui, The War and the Machine. The lecture will start at 6. Thank you very much.